Good morning. It's story time again. Today I'm going to read to you from Tale of Half Truths, which is a collection of 15 short stories. I'm not going to read the whole thing, a whole short story, but I'm going to read a portion of Prince of Passions, which is based on a story, based loosely on a story that I had heard from a Peruvian friend of mine. And this would have been his grandmother's story, retold, fictionalized a bit, but basically, okay? And it's heavy, but bear me out. This is my short story. Dia Lucia had been a very young woman when she fell in love with a traveling salesman from Peru who had come home for dinner one evening with her father. It was obvious that they had been at the pub, and after the dishes had been cleared, the men sat out back smoking cigarettes and finished the bottle of pisco that the visitor had finally kindly procured. The man came back the next day and took Dia. Just like that, he walked into the house without knocking, picked her up, and swatting her screaming mother out of the way, walked right back out. Walked her to the train station and through the airport, boarding alongside her on a plane bound for Lima. She was but 12 years old. The salesman locked her in his apartment on the 8th floor and beat her when she complained of her confinement. He raped her, too, between the beatings. He would smack her to the ground, then lay on her, pressing his elbow into her cheek as he tore her insides out. His simmering cigarette clenched between stained teeth. He had been gone for months when the baby came. Sitting on the bathroom floor in a puddle of blood and water, confused, shivering, and frightened, the beautiful girl, Dia Lucia, clasped her daughter to her chest, her sobs echoing off the porcelain walls as her placenta was expelled. She was terrified. How could she ever protect her baby when she couldn't protect herself? She hadn't set foot outside the man's apartment complex since the day he had brought her home. She had loved him and hadn't cared whether her family found her or not, hadn't wanted them to. It didn't take her long to grow to hate him, though. She was sitting by the kitchen window, rocking Alexandra, doing just that when he walked in. He dropped his bag by the floor and stared at the baby in her arms. Walking slowly over to them, he placed the bag of groceries on the counter and extended his arms for the baby. He held his daughter gently in his arms, up close to his face, and steadied the child, admiring her. After a few minutes, he handed Alexandra back to the mother's arms, grabbed his hat, and left for the pub, not saying a word. He was still there, halfway through his second bottle of House Red, when they came to tell him about the fire. It was too late. There was nothing anyone could do. The fire trucks poured streams of water onto the blaze desperately, but the entire building was engulfed. Escapees and neighbors stood by, horrified, listening helplessly. The screams had stopped long before the salesman stumbled onto the devastating scene. They found Dia Lucia where he had left her in the kitchen, face down, her body shielding her babies. Javier had grown up hearing the stories of his great-grandmother, how the firefighters had carried the blistered Alexandra out from the wreckage behind the charred remains of her mother, how she had been the sole survivor saved by the love of her mother, how she had been raised by her father's sister, and how, for years afterwards, his drinking had gotten worse until one day it had gotten better. He had gone from job to job, traveling, rarely returning home, until finally he did. He brought with him another wife and had another 8 children, though in truth he had many, many more. Alexandra would eventually meet 26 of her father's other children over the course of her lifetime. Apparently, the scoundrel had wives and families throughout South America. In his later years, he had been passed from family member to family member when they, one by one, had emigrated to the States. By the time that the old goat came to live with Javier's family, he was well into his 90s. Though his mother, saint that she is, had doted on him, Javier, leaning on the porch railing smoking a cigarette, had watched his grandfather drink beer and wish he'd die. Eventually, he did, at the age of 99. I'll stop there. So again, this is loosely based on a friend of mine's story. So as a writer, people say, what do you write about? Well, the rule of thumb is we write about what we know about, to some degree. We are writers, and if we're creative writers, writers of fiction, or literary writers, we embellish. And we sometimes blend histories and, so, I call it fodder, right? We live our lives and events happen and we hear stories and sometimes they just mesh and become this other thing entirely. Well, this is one of those examples that if the friend of mine ever read this, he would probably recognize where it came from. So, anyway, enjoy your day. If you haven't read my work yet, it's up on Amazon. Please leave a review. Reviews are an indie author's best friend. My novel, Beneath the Palms, historical fiction set in Florida after the Civil War, taking us up to just after World War II. And it's told in a very very short chapters through a lot of characters, kind of like little cameos. It's a very interesting, fun read. Also, it deals with intensity because you can't talk about the history of America without talking about the truth of racism. And Florida is in the deep South, deepest as you can get, and Jim Crow still alive and well, was alive and well for a long time. So you can't talk about the history of Florida without talking about racism or sexism, which I do. But also lots of fun characters, so go ahead and read it. I have a bunch of other books and collections of poetries, essays, and some semi-autobiographical work. So go ahead, read my work, support your favorite indie author, and please leave a review. Have a great day and be happy.